Good evening, everyone, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So today's lecture is going to be on the Neo-Assyrian period, what we call kind of the golden age of Assyrian history. Probably the most prominent period in Assyrian history, the most important for many historians because it's also extremely well archived, well documented. The kings in the Neo-Assyrian period, for example, King Sargon, King DeKelaita III, King Sennacherib, King Sarhaddon, King Ashurbanipal, his son, all of these kings had extensive archives. So this period is the most well-documented period, in addition to being kind of the height of Assyrian power, military power, economic power, political power. It is certainly the height of Assyrian accomplishments also. So let's begin to talk about the Neo-Assyrian period and understand a few things about it. First of all, it's a period of time where the empire grows. And again, I want to emphasize that in the next classes, we are going to discuss the various kings who have documented their history, their accomplishments, and focus on their writings to try to understand what happened during their reigns, their respective reigns. And we're going to start with King Sargon II. We're also going to talk about his father, DeKelaita III, whose accomplishments were also extensive, lots of reforms in the Assyrian Empire. And then we'll wind it down in about 3 or 4 weeks down to all the way to the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So during the time of Shalmaneser III, according to Shiogo Yamada, a Japanese Assyriologist, this was a time when the Assyrian Empire began to grow tremendously. It undertook ambitious projects both in the east and the west and the south. But we need to remember that Shalmaneser III, whose image that you see here, and this is in Ankara Museum in Turkey, came after Ashurnasirpal II. And part of the reason I'm going to give you a little bit of a chronology here is that so we understand that the Assyrian Empire didn't happen overnight. It wasn't similar to the Mongol Empire, for example, or the empire of Alexander the Great. Well, all of a sudden, one great person kind of rises, or one very able person, let's say, if you don't want to call him great, one able person rises and is willing to challenge the status quo and grows his empire, and then after his death, the empire kind of falters and falls apart. That's not the case here. And one of the reasons I'm going over a little bit of a chronology here, not the most important thing, you can go over this yourself, is because I want you to understand that things happened before certain kings came and listed their accomplishments. So they were, in effect, riding on the shoulders or standing on the shoulders of their forefathers, previous kings. And of course, it's not fair to say only one king. It's really very likely an entire administration. Each king had an administration, although Assyrian kings were what we call absolute rulers or absolute monarchs in this period. It is also very important to remember, and we will allude to it in various passages in this lecture, that they had an administration. They had other people they could rely on. It was a very tightly knit but very extensive organization. So it's important to remember that it's not one king. One king was kind of a symbolic, almost a connection to a god. He was the regent of the god Ashur. Every king was. But he was also, important to remember, part of an entire administration. And I want to refer to just I'm not going to read the entire thing here, but the entire quote from Ashurnasirpal II. Ashurnasirpal II has been called one of the cruelest of Assyrian kings. And of course, it's important to remember that what was happening in this passage in particular was the way things were at the time. It's not fair to say that Ashurnasirpal II was crueler than other people simply because we do not have their documentation of how they viewed the war. But certainly the Egyptians, the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks all took part in violence. And this violence wasn't simply, just something that happens. Of course, you carry swords, you carry spears, you use fire to inflict on your enemies, you cut off heads, you cut off fingers, whatever it was done, without going into detail here. But one of the things the ancient Assyrian kings did much more extensively than others is they kept a very detailed record. They kept a very detailed record, both written and artistic. And this is the thing that gets them in trouble with a lot of people because they get swayed by seeing that, well, they certainly wrote about it. Well, if they wrote about it, they documented it, it means they are more cruel than others. Were they cruel? Well, of course. I mean, you don't get to run an empire by being a nice guy. You don't get to conquer territory by shaking people's hands and passing gifts around. That's not the way it happens in real history. And we're going to allude to it in various segments of Assyrian history and discuss it, for example, during the Achaemenid times and during the Sasanian times, during the times of the Arab conquest and Roman conquests and Byzantine conquests and so on. Every empire in the history of humankind has committed violence, horrible violence. No empire in the history of mankind has been immune from this kind of, from types of violence. But we also know that Ashurbanipal was very kind to a lot of people, and he was the one who invited over 47,000 guests to his residence, or 69,000, excuse me, close to 70,000 people. He had a party where there's a long list of various items that were served to all of these people who were guests from all over the empire that came to the empire. So if he was such a ruthless person, you would think that not many people would show up. Or, I guess, alternatively, maybe they were afraid that if they didn't show up, something bad would happen. So be that as it may, as we said, empires can be very cruel, and Ashurnasirpal certainly could be called a cruel monarch when it was necessary. Ashurnasirpal, one of the things he did was establish a new capital. He was one of the first kings in the Neo-Assyrian period that established a new capital. The capital city, the central city in the heartland of Assyria, which ruled the entire empire, was the city of Ashur. From the city of Ashur, Ashurnasirpal, for reasons that many historians think had to do with his conflict with prominent Assyrian families that were aristocratic that lived in the city of Ashur. Because of his conflict with them, he decided to move his residence where he could possibly wield more influence on his entire land and his entire empire. Now, it's important to remember that Ashur, the city, held a very prominent role, as we said before in class. Ashur was the Vatican, if you will, or the Mecca of the Assyrian Empire, of the Assyrian state, of the Assyrian people. And of course, sadly today, as you know, you can see these beautiful winged creatures, certainly different types of winged bulls and winged creatures are unfortunately destroyed. Here we see the patriarch. I just wanted to show you this image to get an idea of what's happened to the city of Ashurnasirpal II, the city of Nimrud. Now, prior to Ashurnasirpal II, the city of Nimrud was an Assyrian city, but he built an incredibly magnificent palace in this property, and items from this palace are still being dug up and transported to museums in Germany, in France, in England, or were transported. Not so much today. The Iraqis are kind of fully in charge of this site, although have not done, unfortunately, have not done a very good job of keeping it in any kind of shape preserved. Ashur-nasir-pal II was in turn the son of Tukulti-Ninurta, who was the son of Adad-nirari, and Adad-nirari ruled from 911 BC, which is kind of in the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, and who was in turn the son of Ashur-dan. Why do we say Ashur-dan II constitutes the first king of the Neo-Assyrian period? Well, Ashur-dan was one of the first kings that recorded, and his record is rather fragmentary, but it's recorded that he campaigned almost on a yearly basis. He conducted regular campaigns. He went northward, went eastward, and westward to protect certain territories. He was, like other Assyrian kings, labeled as the expander of the land of Ashur, Mat Ashur. And so one of the reasons, of course, we will see that the Assyrians expanded their territories was to make sure that there was peace in the heartland of Assyria. And this is very important. So what marks the Neo-Assyrian Age kind of differently from other periods? Well, there was method. We can now understand that diplomacy and war was waged differently. So oftentimes when people refer to Assyrian cruelty, they're not talking about the old Assyrian period or the middle Assyrian period. They're typically talking about the Neo-Assyrian period, and that's because of the plethora of documentation during this time. But we also see a lot of diplomatic correspondence. There are over 2,000 letters, correspondence of Assyrian kings that have been dug up, and many of them have been translated, certainly not all of them. And more than half of these, by the way, belong to one particular king, and that is Sargon II, who we're going to talk about in the next lecture. So the other different aspect of the empire, the Neo-Assyrian Age, was that there was a standing Assyrian military where people would serve military service or engage in military service. And this is something they had to do. State organization and administration, there was a system of communication built. Buildings of roads and cities took on an explosion, as it were. This is the time of the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh and the Ashurbanipal Library. These are two very important accomplishments of the Assyrians. And of course, you know the Hanging Gardens, everyone thinks they were in the city of Babylon. Most archaeologists and historians and Assyriologists think that that is unfortunately mythical and a mistake of later Greek and Roman writers, and that the truth is, and all the evidence shows, including archaeological and artistic evidence, and including textual evidence, that really all the fingers point to Sennacherib, King Sonchiru of Assyria, as being the builder and he takes a lot of pride of building these gardens in the city of Nineveh. There was tremendous agricultural output, and we're going to refer to the agriculture that Assyria is able to accomplish also in the future when it becomes a state within the Persian Empire, for example. But agricultural output was very important. Remember, all empires are interested in a form of energy. And so when you don't have oil or gas, we're fighting a lot about oil and gas these days. What do you have? You certainly have agricultural output. You have grains to feed animals so that animals can do the work, so on and so forth. And to feed people, you need people to do work. So you need this energy, and the Assyrian Empire was organizing itself in a very efficient way to use the energy as best as possible to build power for the center and also to build peace and get rid of chaos throughout the empire. There were mass migrations and deportations during this time, and we're going to talk about this. We're going to touch on this a little later. There was also a period of assimilation. So Aramaic became prominent as a language being used by the Assyrian scribes alongside Akkadian at this time, but there was also Assyrianization of various peoples. And Simo Parpola in particular has done great work in this regard, and I'll share the article with you in an email, where he talks about the nation building that the Neo-Assyrian kings undertook. And what happened was that people were assimilated. How do we know they were assimilated? Because we can check the generations. For example, they had either Hurrian or Aramaean names or sounding names, and then their children have Akkadian sounding names. And then, of course, the reverse also happens, but people become part of the Assyrian state and they take on Aramaic names because people are interacting with each other. This is a period also where Assyrian ideology takes on an imperial tone. So Assyria has an imperial ideology that is advocated by its kings. This is a period of economic dominance of the Assyrian Empire and prosperity. It is also a time of archival, literary, and scientific achievements where the Assyrian Empire excelled like no other before it, and which eventually it gave rise to the other empires that came, which are really based in the Assyrian Empire. A lot of historians say the Persian Empire and the Macedonian later after it and the Roman empires are kind of a continuation of the system that was set by the Assyrians. So on cruelty, I want to say something here. And Fallis, Mario Fallis, who's a historian and a Assyriologist, notes that our knowledge of the Assyrians being cruel and who had an ideology of terror are the product of over-reliance by historians of the Assyrian royal inscriptions on the royal inscriptions and palace reliefs. So, for example, when we looked at King Ashurnasirpal II's comments about what he did to his enemies, we should not over-rely on these writings to understand whether the Assyrians were crueler than others. So we understand, of course, that there was violence, and Assyrians documented it, but we shouldn't over-rely on these inscriptions because a lot of them were written for propaganda purposes and for psychological, to instill psychological fear in others. Certainly, for example, Olmsted, one of the historians, says this about Assyrian art, that it was meant to instill fear in the enemies of Assyria when they came, for example, to visit the Assyrian king. They would be led into this hall where all these sculptures in a very detailed, back then it was very detailed, artistic display showed enemies being overwhelmed and beheaded and so on. So by the time the king was ready to see the envoy, the foreign envoy, he was, terrorized enough to be psychologically overcome, as it were, by the Assyrians. Certainly, the Assyrian war machine was new during this time. It developed. Of course, it based itself on earlier, the Middle Assyrian and the Old Assyrian period, but it was different. Assyrians developed ramps, battering rams, siege towers, and other innovations. They were also using iron weapons to a great deal of success at this time. And there was an expanded system of communication. This was a turning point in the history of communications, the creation and implementation of an innovative, long distance, high speed information network designed for the exclusive needs of the state, the direct forerunner of the Persian relay dispatch, so admired by Herodotus and Xenophon. And what we're talking about here is that this was, in effect, the Pony Express. And people thought that the Persians were the ones who first came up with the system. Certainly not true. The Assyrians had certainly perfected this long prior to the arrival of the Persian Empire. So the relay system involved having the trust in various people so that you don't give something to somebody and he takes it directly to the person you're targeting, the recipient. You have various people traveling as the empire grew, giving one to the other to kind of speed up the communication. So, which would, of course, would go along with the creation of the road system, the guards all along the road system of the empire, and so on and so forth. Things that we many times attribute to the Persians and the Romans, but it turns out the Assyrians had developed the system long before the Romans and before the Persians. What kinds of letters were sent? So we have an Assyrian governor in the Zagros provinces and deep in Iran, for example, operating in the area, and he's writing to King Sargon, "To the king, my lord, your servant, Sin Nadi. Good health to the king, my lord. I have no scribe where the king sent me to," this new area where the king has sent him to rule. Let the king direct either the governor of Arafah, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's actually a neighborhood in Kirkuk, and that's the old name of the city of Kirkuk, of Arafah, or Ashur Belutakin, to send me a scribe. Send me a scribe, please. I need a scribe. And of course, a scribe was not just someone who wrote, it was someone who likely kept archives and kept track of various letters so you can kind of organize your communication. And it's very important to organize your communication with the Assyrian king if you're going to be a governor, as well as with others. So a scribe had very important duties and was a respected person. As we'll see, we'll refer to scribes throughout this period of Assyrian history. This period also saw the production of many treaties. Now, the earliest treaty we have is from the time of, I guess we would call it the Middle Assyrian period. Sometimes scholars refer to the Middle Assyrian period as, for example, from the 16 or the 1400s to close to 1000 BC. Sometimes it overlaps with the Neo-Assyrian period. But treaties, or momita in modern Assyrian, adde in Old Assyrian, or mamitu, were a very important part of running the empire. Why is that? Because having someone swear to a treaty assures you, and that swearing is done before the gods, who are very important, your God and their gods. Okay? In other words, these treaties are sanctified. They're very important. And so it gives you a sense of stability, that things will stay in place. You need things to stay in place as you grow, as you develop, as you acquire wealth, because stability is going to allow you to plan. When you don't have stability, when you don't know where people stand, you're going to probably suffer, and your planning is going to suffer. So imposing this edde or momita, mamitu, always included swearing an oath. 3 examples: the inscriptions of Sennacherib called Padi, the king of Ekron, as possessor of Edde and the oath of the country of Assyria. So that was kind of a status that the person had, this king had, of Ekron, okay, in Philistia, okay, a Philistine king. An advisor of Sarhaddon passes a crushing verdict over the Cimmerians. They are the offspring of outcasts who recognize no oath sworn by a god and no adne. In other words, people who cannot swear an oath, who cannot abide by a treaty, are uncivilized. They are the offspring of outcasts. A hostile Elamite ruler is characterized in an inscription of his former ally Ashurbanipal, Umaniga, for whom, sorry, misspelling there, for whom I performed acts of kindness and whom I appointed as king of Elam, who forgot my favors and did not honor the Edde. You must honor the treaty because you gave an oath, a momita or mamitu in the ancient Assyrian language. Sworn, the oath sworn by the great gods. And oftentimes we see kings, when they wanted to start a war, they would refer to, for example, he's a violator of an oath. And by the way, this is not the only time in ancient history that people refer to breaking oaths as being something that triggers a conflict. We see this being referred to today. At the time that we are speaking, is the conflict between the United States and Russia over Ukraine. One of the things the Russians are saying is you did not keep your word as to the promises that you gave us when NATO was moving eastward towards Russian territory, for example. You promised, but you broke your promise. So the earliest, as we said, the attestation of the term manitu or momita in modern Assyrian is an Assyrian inscription that dates to the reign of Tiglath-Pileser the very first Tiglath-Pileser in 1114 BC. And so what this means is that there was a continuity very clear continuity between the Middle Assyrian period, going back in time to Ashur-uballit, and even before that, all the way through to the Neo-Assyrian period. Yes, the Minsk Accords. Thank you, Ashurbanipal. I thank you for that, because I definitely did not. I definitely could not name that, but you brought it back to me. So Tiglath-Pileser I says, I captured all of the kings of the Neri lands, which are the area of north of the Hakkari, some of the around the Lake Van, what is Lake Van, in southeastern Turkey. I captured them alive. I had mercy on those kings and spared their lives. I released them from their bonds and fetters in the presence of the god Shemesh, my Lord, and made them swear the oath of my great gods for servitude in all eternity. So they've become vassals. And so what we see here is a different type of diplomacy. Perhaps people would have expected Tiglath-Pileser to slay all of his enemies, but he captured them and he freed them and he made them swear an oath. And hopefully they do not break their promise. And we have examples of people who are, and the reason I'm going over this a little bit is to see the other side of so-called Assyrian cruelty, that you do have people such as this person, for example, who is saying that, I acquired a lot of wealth, and the king of Assyria and all the house of Assyria was to me a father and mother, and a mother. And the Danunians, and I'm not sure which people these are, probably somewhere north of Sidon in the Lebanon area, and the Assyrians were a single house. And in other words, and my people and the Assyrians were a single house. So we see, for example, Assyrian methods certainly did not involve only warfare. Did involve warfare when it was necessary. But when it was not necessary, there are various expressions in Assyrian records that say speak kindly to them. When corresponding, for example, with their governors, speak kindly to them. And Professor Lawson Younger has an excellent article, which I will pass to you, that talks about the Assyrian Empire's focus on economic betterment. So this is another method that the Assyrians used to kind of control this area that was different during the Neo-Assyrian times. And so he contradicts the assessment of various other Assyriologists who say, well, the ancient Assyrians didn't really understand the value of economic relations. They just basically took from the periphery, took from the various areas they conquered, and brought it into the center of Assyria. And he shows in very good archaeological and from archaeological and textual evidence that in fact the Assyrians were very sophisticated in the way they dealt with the conquered people, in the way they dealt with the people of the empire. Neo-Assyrian kings formed a new supranational system of political control in the eastern Mediterranean basin, which produced the Pax Assyriaca, decades of unparalleled growth and development, and an international trading network which spanned the Mediterranean, stimulating Phoenician trade and colonization in the west, and also actually controlling Phoenician, being part of the Phoenician trade that went all over the Mediterranean, reaching Spain and various areas of North Africa. Certainly, this is different than what the average person thinks of the Assyrians, which is, well, they were just cruel and they just killed everyone. They were just brutes. No intelligence to what they were doing. It was simply, barbaric behavior. This is certainly different, and this is not something someone is just saying out of the blue here, just mentioning it in terms of where it's coming from. It's certainly based in textual, archaeological, documentary evidence, reliable evidence. Mario Fallis, another Assyriologist, says on the Assyrian peace, the Pax may probably be best described as an enforced policy of juridical and administrative character that aimed at political and socio-economic stability in the lands that had fallen under the Assyrian hegemony, that served the general economic interests of the empire. So it wasn't a matter of simply taking from the periphery and, in effect, looting the periphery for the benefit of the center. It was to benefit, of course, Assyrian kings cared about themselves. They cared about their power and cared about their families and the people that were around them. But they also understood that unless you take care of the people that are living there, and we have plenty of documents attesting to this, you certainly don't understand how to run an empire. And when you're talking about a people that ruled for hundreds of years, you must conclude that they understood how to rule an empire. Otherwise, it wouldn't last for close to 1,000 years. Assyrians were concerned with obtaining maximal profit from the appropriation of primary production, so agriculture, as we said before, animal breeding, secondary production, commodities and luxury items, and human resources, generalized workforce, and specialized craftsmen. And that includes, of course, military service. To obtain the maximal profit, there was a need for good management that encouraged shulumu, or peace, shlama. It was advantageous to the Assyrians to restore some normalcy and economic viability to the areas they had conquered for the purpose of maintaining a prosperous trading network. Why are we doing it? Of course, we have an interest in doing it because we want to build this powerful trade network. It's not a matter of just going and attacking and killing people. It's a matter of running the empire once the wars are over, once the battles are done. Now, of course, the goal was always to establish shlumu, or shlama. So in the case of particularly rebellious client kingdoms like Israel during certain times, not always, and Damascus during certain times and not always, this could look quite different than in the compliant areas. So in other words, in compliant areas, there was a different reaction of the Assyrian Empire, because the overall goal was to establish trading ports all over the empire. The Assyrians' deep and abiding interest in establishing karani, ports or quays, and bitkarani, trading posts, evinces that trade was of paramount value. The Neo-Assyrian Karu system demonstrates this point. The name pattern Kar X, Kar, for example, Kar Ashur, port or quay of X, which is most often a divine or royal name, for example, Nergal or Nabu or Ashur, was purposefully chosen to show that the Assyrians were ready to enhance the local economy by encouraging trade along their new frontiers. So what does this mean? This means that where they were creating posts in foreign lands, they were giving them important divine names. Why was that? Because they wanted the people to know that they respected those areas. You wouldn't give a divine name, something of value to you, if you didn't consider that area and those people important. And this is a map that gives you an idea of the establishment of various trading posts. These are the ones we know of so far, and of course there are others. But you get an idea of the reach of the Assyrian Empire, and of course it went beyond this all the way to the Indus and all the way to Spain, to the Indus, probably to the east, because tin came from areas in Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli came from the area of Afghanistan, and then of course there were other products that came from the west of the Mediterranean that wound up in Assyria as well. So constant attention was given by the Assyrian monarchy to the protection and maintenance of the trade routes, which means, again, so the roads had to be run the right way, and that the Assyrians had definite concerns about long-distance trade and its cultivation. Assyrian control of Phoenician trade. These treaty stipulations between the Assyrians and many of the Phoenician city-states, for example, Tyre and Sidon, excuse me, beyond any shadow of a doubt, make it unambiguous that the Assyrians were intimately involved in the maritime trade of the Phoenicians. And where did the Phoenicians go? As you know, the Phoenicians, as you probably know, went and established, for example, an area in Carthage, which is in North Africa, where Morocco and Algeria are, and established an empire in there and fought with Rome. Hannibal, I'm sure you probably heard of Hannibal, who challenged Rome, came from Carthage. And Carthage, of course, was a colony of the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians, being sailors in the Mediterranean, went all over the place. Some speculate they even reached America at some point, but I don't think there's any evidence. So the control of ports was very important. Tiglath-Pileser III control of ports and trading posts along the Mediterranean coast was extended further southward in his campaigns against Philistia in 734 BC. In this campaign, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Gaza and despoiled the royal property and the people. Though Hanunu, king of Gaza, again, this is Philistia, survived on the throne, the Assyrians established their presence in the city, setting up images of the Assyrian gods and of the king in the palace, and establishing an Assyrian custom house, Betkari Shamat Ashur, Assyrian custom house. These ports that were established by the Assyrians also led to the enhancement of what we know as the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road, the Great Khorasan Road that led from Mesopotamia through the Zagros Mountains and, of course, goes all the way to China. And this is very, very important in knowing, for example, the value that Assyrians attributed to these roads and to the economic system. Consequently, there can be little doubt that this was the determining factor in the relatively gentle Assyrian approach that was taken. The route of the Silk Road was used already in Assyrian times. So the gentle approach towards certain type of people that were living in what is known as Media, the Medes, or the Persians in that area, Iran deep in the heart of Iran. The Assyrians took the gentle approach because they valued the importance of trade and fostering it. Now, we've got to remember, in terms of continuity, the Assyrians were, descendants of old Assyria, the old Assyrian merchants. If you remember, in the very first class, we discussed the old Assyrian trade, and that was something extremely important. And of course, that continued on. That never really died out. The Assyrian merchant spirit, as it were, never really died out. Those the over-reliance that people had on the descriptions of certain Assyrian kings, for example, Ashur-nasir-pal II, kind of blinds us to the other part of Assyrian history, which is very important to know. So Assyriologist Karen Radner, who's one of my favorite Assyriologists, a great lady who is Austrian, says that Assyrian officials were eager to interact positively with the populations of the empire and to maintain shlumu or shlama. This is what the Assyrian kings were trying to do when they could. And of course, when there was a problem, and when speak kindly to them, in other words, diplomacy did not work, the Assyrian kings had to resort to something else, which is conducting diplomacy by, as we say, other means. This is a passage, a tablet to kings. So we have to look at these types of primary sources to kind of understand the situation. And this is an example of the reporting that was done to the Assyrian kings when it came to taking care of the economic interest of the empire. Here is a governor writing to King Tiglath-Pileser III, your servant Hurdi Ashur-Lamur, concerning the Tyrian, and this is the city of Tyre, the king Hiram, about whom the king Tiglath-Pileser said, "Speak kind words with him." Keep that in mind. Speak kind words with him. All the ports of trade have been released to him. In other words, they're under his control. His servants go in and out of the trading posts as they wish, and they sell and buy. Mount Lebanon is at his disposal, and they go up and down as they wish and bring down the timber. Whoever brings down the timber, I collect his tax. I have appointed tax collectors over the ports of trade, Karani, of the entire Mount Lebanon. They are standing guard over the mountain. So the Assyrians had an interest in allowing people, just like all governments, allowing people to operate their trade, but they had to tax the gains that people made, or the labor that people engaged in, which was profitable. Investments and returns. The impression that immediately emerges from a survey of Assyrian documents is that there was capital, and that investment, including contracts with the king himself, was productive of worthy returns. These documents attest to trade and commerce. Remember, contracts, which means legal transactions. Trade and commerce throughout the empire, with merchants and caravans, both Assyrian and non-Assyrian, crisscrossing its territory via numerous routes. The text also witnessed to the Assyrian state's involvement in canals on the Khabur and the Euphrates, verified through archaeology. There was continuity in the Neo-Assyrian period with the earlier Middle Assyrian period, I would even say the Old Assyrian period, while the Middle Assyrian Dunnu fortified agricultural center was no longer the pattern. The Neo-Assyrian agricultural estates and programs of development were based on the earlier model, in other words, of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And what would happen is that the Assyrians would consolidate a lot of towns, which allowed for better security and protection of valuable items, commodities. An interesting example can be seen in the development of the Wadi Ajaj region in the days of Adad Nirari under the authority of Nergal Cherish, with 331 towns being established. That's a tremendous amount of building that was going on in certain areas of the empire. So it's important to know that the Assyrian kings represented themselves and represented their establishment as kind of caring for the peace, the shulumu or the shlama of everyone that lived in the empire. So a quick perusal of everyday epistolary documents, which form about 50% of overall documentation of the state archives, demonstrate the deep interest of the crown in the shulumu or peace of the provinces and their agricultural status. The Assyrian kings do not want chaos. They want there to be peace. They want contentment among the people. And they are especially concerned about issues such as the quantity and quality of the harvest. This was always a major concern. Remember why? Because this is the energy that is necessary to run the empire. This was not simply all about what could be extracted to the Assyrian center, because the backbone of the Assyrian Empire was the provincial system, whose chief preoccupation was the supply of the army. The importance and maintenance of royal granaries can be seen in a number of Neo-Assyrian letters. Maintaining these granaries is not simply an interest for the military, but it's also feeding the people, making sure that people do not go hungry. And one of the examples that we have of Assyrian ingenuity is the way they dealt with the olive oil industry, which was in Philistia, or in the areas of Gaza. What is Gaza? Israel, or Palestine, all the way going up to Syria. In particular, the Assyrians greatly fostered, for their own benefit, the development of the olive oil industry, previously unknown in the city of Ekron, but native to conquered Judah, and turned it into a product of prosperous international commerce, presumably directed westward toward Egypt and North Africa. So the Assyrians were, helping to create, in other words, from these areas, olive oil production and shipping it in Mediterranean areas, perhaps where eventually the Phoenicians would take it and sell it to areas in North Africa, where they eventually developed a colony, Carthage. There were investments in cities and projects that were tremendous during this time. The Assyrian crown invested money within the empire, with cities, temples, and officials receiving their share. So there was a growth of wealth during this time. Part of the commodities distributed came back to the crown's property by way of taxation, and it is also thought that taxes the king benefited from in private trade. Large-scale projects such as the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh and Sennacherib's aqueduct and Ashurbanipal's library were examples of this type of spending. So if you think of the aqueduct of King Sennacherib, which you can see today, of Jirwan, you can walk it, you can read some of the inscriptions. This was a tremendous accomplishment that brought fresh, clear water into the great city of Nineveh, which had an estimated 100,000 people living in it, which was a tremendous number for the time. And here we have an artist's rendering of what the Hanging Gardens, which we used to think were in Babylon, but actually turn up in Nineveh, what they may have looked like based on archaeological evidence. And this is just a relief from the time of King Sennacherib. And King Sennacherib talks a lot about how he allowed water to be transported upwards and to build all types of gardens. He doesn't call them hanging gardens, but from the description, he brought plants from all over the empire, including from India, and kept them in his gardens in Nineveh. And we think, archaeologists speculate, that this was what was the Hanging Gardens and not the one in Babylon, because that just unfortunately has no historical basis for it. No archaeological evidence of any sort, no textual evidence, and so on. Under King Ashurbanipal, during the during the Neo-Assyrian period, Assyria was at the center of the world, militarily, politically, economically, and culturally. Ashurbanipal could, with much justification, refer to himself as King of Assyria, King of the universe, the known universe at the time. The king ordered scholars to search for the tablets and writings of the ancients thousands of years before him and to bring them back to his library in Nineveh, helping to build the largest collection of literature in the ancient world. So incredible was this library. So incredible was this library that hundreds of years later, the Library of Alexandria, which is estimated to contain less than half of what was contained in the Ashurbanipal library, less than half, according to serious scholars. Now, some have said there were hundreds of thousands of documents, but none of that is based on any reliable historical evidence. There is a very good article on the subject of the Library of Alexandria comparing how many documents there are, and it's estimated to be somewhere between 10 to 15,000. The Ashurbanipal library had about twice as much, and those are the tablets that have remained. Now, we also think that there were, because the library was burned, that there were many Aramaic documents that were written on papyrus material that, when is burned, of course, does not survive. And of course, that is not with us. So the Neo-Assyrian Age, centuries later, the greatness achieved by Assyria during this time, during this 400-year period, became legendary even after its power was gone centuries later. Greeks, Romans, and Europeans wrote about the Assyrians and their military prowess, wondrous architecture, and political abilities, at times with much embellishment, such as, for example, and we will take this topic up because many people have asked me, the story of Queen Semiramis, for example. Who was she? Was she real? Whose wife was she? Was she really queen or not? So we'll discuss this in the next class. Assyria's greatness did not come suddenly, as I emphasized. Having come to power on a throne that had over 100 Assyrian kings before him, Ashurbanipal recognized the long road his kingdom and empire had navigated and often brought up the achievements of his ancestors with pride. Assyria in the 7th century BC had a continuous history spanning thousands of years before. Although it had surpassed the might of all Western civilizations that came before, Assyria viewed itself as a continuation of the civilizations of Soma and Eket. When modern Assyrians look back to the height of the political, military, and economic prominence of their history, and this includes the artistic achievements, it is the Neo-Assyrian period that inspires them the most, with tales of great kings and their spectacular achievements, as well as the artistic creations that have been replicated today. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to answer some questions that have been sent through the chat. Is everyone okay? All right. And I have a question. Mr. DeKelaita, was there any modern day Assyrians as of the last century? I'm not sure I understand. Was there any modern treaty of Assyrians as the last century? The treaties concerning Assyrians in the last century, and we're going to talk about the modern period later in the class, so I hope you stick around. But the treaties came largely from Western powers, Western and regional powers. So there was no treaty made by the Assyrians themselves. Okay. Slew. Okay. Peace equals oppression. Okay. Thank you. So much Assyrian archives is endless. Assyria recorded all. Okay. Thank you. Is Carthage the oldest example of a city-state ruled by a republic? Is Assyriology challenging the idea that Athens is the first democracy? No. Assyriology and Assyriologists have not challenged the idea that that Athens is the earliest democracy. That system definitely originated in Athens, and I don't think there's any challenge to that. Now, Is that the perfect democracy? Obviously, it isn't. Um, Carthage was, I'm not an expert on Carthage, but it was a republic, like the Roman Republic. So, so I hope that's clear. Um, could you point out some major religious figure of that time? Um, I'm not sure. Thank you. I'm not sure what the question is. Could I point out a religious figure at the time? In other words, a priest. Um, there were certainly priests. I mean, I can't recall their names. Assyrian priests. Sadheddin was an Assyrian king who was supposed to be a priest because his older brother was supposed to be the king, and unfortunately for his older brother, who I'll tell you, I'll leave the story for next time. What happens to his older brother? But Sarhaddon, instead of being the priest of a temple, becomes the king. So these people were very prominent, and priests, by the way, at that time could marry. They certainly were not celibate, like for example Catholic priests. Um, okay, now Um, I'm sure a lot of you have questions that are, let's keep them focused on this topic. Um, so I see a question on the Assyrians in the diaspora and who's this a leader similar to a patriarch. I would rather address these questions when the time comes. So I want to be able to focus on, you know, kind of, I don't want to say laser-like focus on a period of time, but we do want to focus on the Neo-Assyrian period. Um, so we're not talking about modern Assyrians now. We're really focused on this period in time. So if you don't mind, keep your questions to this period because um, this is a class after all. It's not just a simple lecture, and we want to be able to learn about this period in time, and then we're going to move on to other periods. So I would really appreciate it if you can keep um, the questions focused on the Neo-Assyrian period, which was a period of 300 to 400 years prior to the fall of Assyria. Okay. The map that you showed with the trails, were those the trading routes? Yes. And trading colonies or custom houses, as it were. And these custom houses and trading colonies, I guess you can call them commerce houses, kept, working even after the fall of the empire. Many of them. We have one, for example, in the town of Dur Katlimu, which is in today's Syria, Tel Ahmed or Sheikh Ahmed in Syria, that continued on long after the fall of the Assyrian Empire and was operating during what we call Neo-Babylonian, during the Neo-Babylonian period and even Achaemenid times. We have the tablets from those times. So yes, these were trading routes, and there was something called the King's Road, which went from South Mesopotamia through Assyria and all the way through the Levant. That probably has been duplicated today, is underneath maybe some of the roads that exist in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and so on. So yes, I hope that answers your question, Roxanne. Regarding Karbala or Karbala in Iraq, was it one of the Kar? Very good question. The word Kar in ancient Assyrian means town or place, and then of course there is and of course it's an Assyrian or Akkadian, I should say, an Akkadian expression that you can find up until today, like in certain towns in Iraq, for example, Karamulisi, Karimlis in the Nineveh Plain, which is still dominated by Assyrians members of the Chaldean church, Karamulisi, called Karimlish, and other towns. So Karbala is certainly one of them, the Babylonian version uh, of an Assyrian type of town. Can you share a bit more detail about the sort of double-edged sword of the image of the Assyrians as being associated with the might of the Neo-Assyrian Empire? I'm curious how you think that this era, and we often pride ourselves maybe making it more difficult for us today. Well, good question. The Neo-Assyrian period was a period which saw Assyrian might rise. And of course, at the time, nobody ever said, "Oh, the Assyrians are very cruel." They probably thought the Assyrians were very powerful, and of course, nobody wants to be at the other end of Assyrian violence. Nobody wants to be at the end of any type of violence, of course. But what happens later, long after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, not during the time of the Assyrian Empire, long after the fall, come largely Western audience, Western scholars, and in particular what we call Orientalist scholars, who look at the East as kind of an unchanging, unmoving phenomenon. And they attribute to it certain types of conduct, certain type of behavior, and they kind of make the Assyrians the bad guys of the rest, the very cruel type of person. And this has, up until today, you could see any kind of YouTube presentation, for example, someone talking about Assyrian history, or even the scholars, they'd say, oh, the Assyrians were exceptionally cruel. They were just incredibly cruel, and they were very violent and very. My question to these people is, what sorts of conquerors are not violent? What, the Spanish conquistadors, the British rulers, the Americans who conquered the West? Ask the Native Americans. The Boers who conquered Africa, the Russians who conquered Turkish territory, the Turks who conquered various areas in the Middle East, the Mongols, the Romans who conquered various Germanic areas. Which of these people did not commit violence? And you'd be hard pressed to come up with anyone. So this is the problem, is that the telling of Assyrian history, in particular by Western scholars, and especially in the 19th century, where they're kind of looking at the Bible and then looking at these Assyrian artifacts and kind of blaming the Assyrians for being, the wrath of the ancient Middle East, just the cruel monarchs and cruel warriors of the ancient past, barbaric in their methods. But a lot of people forget, when you look at the Bible, the Assyrians were supposed to be the ones who carried out the word of God. They were the ones who carried out punishment in the Bible. That's according to the Old Testament. So nowhere in the Old Testament do you see, and this does happen in Nahum, for example, but he does not say Assyrians were cruel. He says, for example, woe to the bloody city, Nineveh, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that influenced later writers. But cruelty in and of itself does not mean that people were hated or were thought to be more ruthless than any other people, as expressed in the Old Testament. But it's certainly a certain, this definition of the Assyrians has lasted from the 19th century until today, and it's very unfortunate. Assyrian colonies lasted a long time. What's the difference of their ruling as compared to the current colonies of Britain? When I say colonies, Assyrian colonies, I'm talking about the commerce colonies, the trading colonies, not necessarily the empire colonies. The empire lasted something like 700 to 800 years, but the trading colonies, when after the Assyrian Empire fell, continued to operate. Okay, what's the difference between the Assyrian monarch and and other monarchs? Well, I mean, it depends. Uh, Depends which monarch we're talking about. But certainly the Persian monarchs and the Babylonian monarchs uh, certainly took the place of the Assyrian monarch in many different ways. For example, the expression "the King of Kings," Shah, which lasted until the fall of the Shah, the last Shah Pahlavi, that came from the Assyrians. That's a classical Assyrian expression. So, um, monarchs emulated the Assyrian monarch, and I think probably even European monarchs later emulated the Assyrian monarchs. So, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. I want to tell you about the next week's class. That is going to be on the Assyrian king Sargon II, but we're going to talk about Tiglath-Pileser, his father, Tiglath-Pileser III, and how he implemented reforms in the Assyrian Empire. And then we're also going to address Queen Semiramis. Was she real? Was she not real? People ask me all the time, and unfortunately, I did not set up a class specifically to address Queen Semiramis, but I promise you I'll address it in a few minutes next week, and then perhaps later we can have a special class on her, Queen Semiramis or Samurama. Thank you very much. Again, I appreciate you being here. God bless you. Stay safe. Thank you very much, Emma. We will see you next time.